It was the boogeyman. Halloween wasn't just a low-budget slasher film. It was the spark that ignited a cultural wildfire, birthing the modern horror genre as we know it. Behind the mask of Michael Myers, chaos brewed, camera crews scrambling with homemade rigs, actors risking injury for realism, and a director gambling everything on atmosphere over gore. But what audiences didn't know was how close this movie came to collapsing. Actors fainted on set, the studio nearly pulled the plug, and one wrong move could have destroyed John Carpenter's career. Today we're peeling back the curtain with 20 shocking facts about Halloween they tried to hide. And wait until you hear the bonus fact, a revelation even die-hard fans will struggle to believe. Stay with us, because the truth is scarier than fiction. The mask was never supposed to exist. The most iconic image in horror, Michael Myers' mask, was never part of the original plan. The production couldn't afford custom designs, so art director Tommy Lee Wallace was sent to a costume shop with $2. He returned with a Captain Kirk mask of William Shatner, blankly staring into space. Painted white, hair teased back, and eye holes reshaped, the mask became chillingly inhuman. It wasn't a monster. It was a man with nothing behind his eyes. Shatner himself admitted later he was horrified when he first saw his likeness twisted into evil. The irony? A mistake born of desperation became cinema's most profitable scare. Without that cheap mask, Halloween may never have become legend. It wasn't brilliance. It was a last-minute bargain that froze audiences in terror. Jamie Lee Curtis almost didn't get the role. Jamie Lee Curtis is now synonymous with Laurie Strode, the scream queen of the genre. But the truth is, she was nearly passed over. Carpenter originally considered lesser-known names, fearing Curtis was just Hollywood royalty trading on her mother, Janet Leigh's fame. Producer Deborah Hill pushed hard for Curtis, sensing her vulnerability was perfect for Laurie. When Curtis auditioned, Carpenter admitted he was stunned by her emotional depth. On set, her professionalism stood out against the chaos of a shoestring budget. Audiences didn't see the pressure Curtis faced to live up to her mother's legacy in Psycho, 1960. What seemed like nepotism was actually a gamble. The movie didn't just make her a star, it defined the archetype of the final girl in horror cinema. The music saved the movie. Carpenter screened Halloween without music for executives. They shrugged. It wasn't scary. The director knew the film needed something primal. In 3 days, Carpenter composed the haunting 5/4 time piano theme, layering synthesizers for dread. The result transformed flat scenes into nerve-shredding suspense. Actress P.J. Soles once recalled that when she first saw it with music, she jumped at her own death scene. What audiences didn't know was that Halloween almost died in silence. It wasn't the knife that cut deepest, it was the score. The soundtrack became one of the most recognizable in cinema, proving that sound, not gore, could terrify. Without that last-minute musical miracle, the movie may never have frightened anyone. Filming took just 20 days. Audiences assume Halloween was a carefully crafted production. In reality, it was a breakneck sprint. The entire film was shot in just 20 days, with a budget of $325,000. Scenes weren't filmed in order, forcing Curtis to track her character's fear level from calm to terrified with a scribbled note system. Crew members wore multiple hats. Deborah Hill doubled as a hand model in the iconic knife scenes. Even the autumn leaves blowing through Haddonfield were fake, painted paper leaves that had to be collected after every take to reuse. The illusion of a chilling Midwestern Halloween was born in springtime California heat. What audiences didn't know was that every frame was built on speed, improvisation, and grit. It wasn't luxury filmmaking, it was guerrilla horror. The original Michael Myers was almost someone else. Nick Castle, the man behind the mask, wasn't hired as an actor. He was Carpenter's friend, hanging around the set, hoping to learn filmmaking. Carpenter casually suggested he put on the mask for fun. Castle's natural, eerie stillness convinced everyone he was perfect. Paid just $25 a day, Castle's movement defined Michael Myers' haunting aura: calm, relentless, mechanical. What audiences didn't know: professional stuntmen and actors were considered, but none captured the blank dread Castle accidentally exuded. Carpenter later admitted the secret to Castle's performance was simple: don't act, just walk. That non-performance terrified millions. It wasn't skill, it was absence, an empty vessel that made evil universal. The studio thought it was too boring. When Carpenter delivered his first cut, producers were worried. The pacing was slow, the violence minimal, and executives feared audiences would yawn instead of scream. One even suggested adding more blood to spice it up. Carpenter refused. He believed suspense, not gore, was the real weapon. Instead of rewriting, he doubled down on atmosphere: longer tracking shots, shadows swallowing the frame, and the camera as predator. The gamble paid off. The quiet tension exploded in theaters, leaving crowds trembling. What audiences didn't know: the studio nearly smothered the movie with cheap shocks. Halloween wasn't about blood. It was about the dread of knowing something terrible is coming and being powerless to stop it. That restraint made it scarier than any slasher that followed. The famous boogeyman line wasn't in the script. One of the most chilling moments comes when little Tommy Doyle whispers, "You can't kill the boogeyman." Yet this haunting line was never in the original script. Carpenter added it on set, inspired by the way children mythologize fear. Actor Brian Andrews delivered it with such sincerity that it elevated Michael Myers from a man into an unstoppable legend. Suddenly, the character wasn't just a killer. He was fear itself, embodied. What audiences didn't know: a single improvised line turned Myers into a cultural archetype. It wasn't just a slasher. It was the birth of modern urban legend on screen. That whisper carried more weight than 1,000 screams, embedding itself in the nightmares of generations. The neighborhood wasn't scary at all. Haddonfield, Illinois, the sleepy town haunted by Michael Myers, was pure illusion. Filming took place in Pasadena, California, in broad daylight with palm trees lurking just outside the frame. To fake the Midwest autumn, crew members spray-painted leaves orange and brown, tossing them into the wind before every shot. Between takes, assistants scrambled to collect and reuse them, stuffing leaves into trash bags for the next scene. Actors sweltered in heavy sweaters under the spring sun. What audiences didn't know: the cozy Midwestern dread was stitched together leaf by leaf, frame by frame. It wasn't real autumn. It was Hollywood magic under a blazing California sky. That fake fall became the most convincing Halloween ever captured on film. The knife sound was a watermelon. The sharp slicing sound of Michael Myers' blade isn't steel meeting flesh. It's a kitchen trick. Sound designer Dan Chalice created the effect by stabbing a watermelon and recording the wet, ripping noise. In post-production, layers of audio were mixed to heighten the brutality. What audiences didn't know: every shiver-inducing stab was born in a fruit experiment, not a murder. It wasn't real violence. It was Foley artistry, proving that imagination can terrify more than gore. Even decades later, when people swear they hear the knife-cutting skin, they're really recalling a watermelon sacrifice to horror history. That humble fruit carried the weight of cinematic terror. Donald Pleasance almost walked away. Dr. Loomis, played by Donald Pleasance, anchors the film with gravitas. But initially, Pleasance didn't want the role. He thought the script was too thin, the budget too low, and the character too one-note. Carpenter pleaded with him, finally convincing Pleasance by highlighting Loomis as the movie's moral compass, the only one who truly sees the evil. On set, Pleasance brought depth to lines Carpenter considered flat, shaping them into prophecy. What audiences didn't know: without Pleasance, Halloween risked collapsing into camp. His performance elevated the film from exploitation into mythology. And before we reveal the next 10 facts, including injuries, censorship battles, and near-death stunts, go ahead and like and subscribe, because this is just the beginning of the chaos behind Halloween. The crew had to share costumes. The budget was so tight that multiple actors often wore the same clothes. Extras swapped shirts. Laurie's wardrobe came from J.C. Penney for less than $100, and Michael's jumpsuit was just a mechanic's coverall bought off the rack. When blood was added, the crew couldn't afford duplicates, so they carefully dabbed on washable paint and scrubbed it out after takes. What audiences didn't know, every costume was recycled, patched, and reused. It wasn't Hollywood glamour. It was survival filmmaking, where actors literally sweated through each other's clothes. That penny pinching added an eerie authenticity. The clothes looked worn, lived in, and disturbingly real, as if terror really seeped into the fabric. The famous POV shots were improvised. The opening scene of Halloween, Michael Myers' point of view as a child killer, was groundbreaking, but it wasn't planned. Carpenter wanted to experiment with the eyes of evil, and cinematographer Dean Cundey rigged a Panaglide camera for long, unbroken takes. It was clunky, heavy, and hard to maneuver. Crew members ducked out of frame as the camera drifted through the house. What audiences didn't know, this technical gamble nearly ruined the first day of filming. Yet those uneasy POV shots became the film's signature style, influencing every slasher that followed. It wasn't a polished trick. It was an accident that turned horror into voyeurism, forcing viewers to see through the killer's eyes. Real knives were used on set. Safety standards in 1978 were not what they are today. Many of the stabbing scenes used actual kitchen knives for realism. Actors like Jamie Lee Curtis and P.J. Soles admitted they felt genuine fear when knives swung inches from their skin. Crew members did their best to choreograph carefully, but mistakes were always possible. What audiences didn't know, one wrong move could have been fatal. It wasn't rubber props. It was cold steel, wielded in close quarters under hot lights. That edge of danger bled into performances, making the screams sharper, the fear more convincing. The terror wasn't always acting. It was survival. Michael Myers was almost called something else. Before the final script, the masked killer didn't have the name Michael Myers. Carpenter originally described him only as the Shape, a faceless, unstoppable force. The human name was a tribute to a British distributor who had supported Carpenter's earlier film Assault on Precinct 13. What audiences didn't know, Myers almost remained nameless, a shadow rather than a man. It wasn't character development. It was a thank you note that cemented a legend. That simple, ordinary name made the horror worse. It suggested the evil could be anyone. The entire movie made more than Star Wars, proportionally Halloween, was made for just $325,000 and went on to gross over $70 million worldwide. Adjusted for inflation, it remains one of the most profitable films in cinematic history. To put it in our perspective, dollar for dollar, it outperformed Star Wars, 1977. What audiences didn't know, a movie stitched together with fake leaves, borrowed clothes, and borrowed cameras, became a financial juggernaut. It wasn't supposed to work. It wasn't supposed to last. But Halloween didn't just succeed. It rewrote the rules of indie filmmaking. That little budget nightmare haunted box offices like no studio system ever expected. Jamie Lee Curtis was paid almost nothing. While Halloween catapulted Jamie Lee Curtis to stardom, her paycheck barely covered rent. She earned just $8,000 for the entire film, a fraction of what her co-stars in later horror franchises would command. Curtis threw herself into the role anyway, often staying late on set to rehearse screams until her voice cracked. What audiences didn't know, the Scream Queen who defined an era was working for less than a month's worth of big city wages. It wasn't about money. It was about proving herself, stepping out of her mother's shadow, and seizing her shot at greatness. That hunger bled into her performance, making Laurie Strode the most relatable survivor in horror history. The crew hid cigarette smoke in shots Carpenter, and cinematographer Dean Cundy wanted a foggy, dreamlike atmosphere in the suburban streets. But they didn't have fog machines. Their solution? Crew members puffed cigarettes behind the camera, blowing smoke into scenes and then darting out of frame. The hazy effect added depth and unease, though the air was stifling for actors. What audiences didn't know, the movie's ghostly visuals weren't high-tech wizardry. They were the byproduct of a chain-smoking crew willing to choke for the perfect shot. It wasn't digital atmosphere. It was grit, smoke, and lungs filled with haze. Critics originally hated it. Today, Halloween is hailed as a classic. But when it premiered, many critics dismissed it as cheap exploitation. The Los Angeles Times called it pointless. Roger Ebert, however, broke ranks, praising Carpenter's mastery of suspense. Word of mouth spread from terrified audiences, not glowing reviews. Slowly, the tide turned. By the time imitators flooded the market, Halloween had been reassessed as groundbreaking. What audiences didn't know, the movie that defined horror was almost buried under bad press. It wasn't instant legend. It was clawed into existence by the sheer force of audience screams. That reversal sealed its legacy. It scared critics into respect. The knife-wielding hand wasn't Michael's. In several shots, the hand holding the knife wasn't Nick Castle's. It was producer Deborah Hill's. Carpenter needed close-ups of the shape stabbing, and Hill volunteered to double. Her small hands gave Myers an eerie, childlike quality, especially in the opening sequence. What audiences didn't know, some of the most frightening moments were performed not by a towering man, but by the producer behind the camera. It wasn't planned casting. It was practicality turned uncanny. Those delicate fingers wrapped around a butcher knife blurred gender and age, reinforcing Michael's inhuman nature. The killer became everyone and no one. Real police were called during filming. The set's suburban realism fooled more than just audiences. At one point, neighbors spotted a masked man stalking around with a knife and called the police. Squad cars arrived mid-shoot, and Carpenter had to rush to explain they were filming a movie. The cops were unimpressed, warning the crew about safety. What audiences didn't know, Michael Myers nearly caused an actual police standoff. It wasn't staged paranoia. It was a production that felt too real, blurring the line between fiction and nightmare. That intrusion from reality only deepened the movie's myth. The monster could walk your street right now. Bonus fact, the ending wasn't really an ending. The final shots of Halloween show empty rooms, Michael's breathing echoing over places he has just haunted. This chilling finale wasn't in the original plan. Carpenter improvised it after realizing a simple "killer is dead" ending felt flat. The choice to let the sound of Myers's breath play over the silent neighborhood suggested he could be anywhere, even in the theater with the audience. What audiences didn't know, that haunting ambiguity was a last-minute fix that became the film's most terrifying stroke of genius. It wasn't closure, it was eternal fear. Halloween wasn't just a horror film, it was a miracle born of desperation, cheap props, borrowed clothes, and fearless actors creating a nightmare that still stalks pop culture. What began as a $325,000 gamble became a billion-dollar legacy, rewriting cinema's rules forever. So, next time you hear those piano keys, remember, evil never really dies.